So welcome everyone. It's very, very nice to see a lot of familiar faces who regularly attend our talks. And thank you also for those who are joining us for the first time. We are very happy to welcome you on today's Qesher event. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Qesher. And you can also find here Sebastian. We are the two people who started this project 3.5 years ago. And our aim was to introduce different Jewish communities from around the world. So we regularly hold Zoom sessions in which we invite speakers who speak about the history, the culture, and also the present day situation of a specific city or a country. So those are our regular events that you normally find on Thursdays and Sundays. And today is a little bit different. We recently started a series which we named the Qesher Book Club because we realized that there are so many books that are somehow connected to our topic, and this is the case today. I also, just before introducing Joey, who is our speaker, I want to say that I know that these are very, very difficult times. We have been, like, for the past over a week now, all our thoughts are constantly on Israel and on our friends and family in Israel. And we know that probably you are feeling the same. And we just want to say that we wanted to keep holding these sessions because we are somehow together in this, and we also wanted to just continue a bit with life and with our topics, and we just want to acknowledge that this is a difficult time for all of us, and thanking your presence here. So with that said, I want to introduce our speaker of today, who is Joey Davidov. She lives in Italy and she's an author, and she's done tremendous research on this topic, and we are very, very excited to listen to her speaking about how she's done the research and how her book came to life, and to tell us about her book. So I'm not going to say more than that. She's also going to introduce herself, and also now we will have approximately 45-minute session about learning about her book. And at the end of the session, we will have Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we will have time to ask questions from Joey after her presentation. So thank you very much. And Joey, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Dora, very much. I'm just going to share my screen just so you can see that I prepared a little slideshow for you. So I'm very excited to see people from all over the place. I'm seeing a lot of hellos from here and there. Hello from Los Angeles. Hello from Modena, Italy. And I see many new faces and some faces of old friends who it's just wonderful to reconnect with. In 2014, I got to read a paper that was written by an art historian who was my neighbor and dear friend. And she was an art historian who uncovered the influence that women had in the Italian Renaissance, because before that it was thought that only men got credit for anything. And in the paper that I read, it was about the influence of the Farnese family women. And the Farnese family were one of the great families that built Rome, one of the great wealthy aristocratic families. And I saw that one of the women had donated money to build a convent for Jewish girls in Rome. So I thought, what's a convent for Jewish girls? And my friend didn't know. So in the world of Google, in this century of ours, you can find, there's no question that goes unanswered if you have the patience. So I spent a lot of time trying to find this convent. And what I found was a place called the Casa dei Catecumeni, the house of converts. And then I discovered that the House of Converts, which had originally been designed by the Farnese women to be a place where a woman who wanted to convert to Catholicism could go for a period of reflection and instruction voluntarily, became a place where Jews were forcibly converted. And so I kept searching, and I discovered a diary that was written by an 18-year-old young woman named Ana del Monte. And it tells the story of what happened to her in that house. And it was hidden because her family got it, and they knew that if it were discovered, that things would not go well for them, because you could not say anything against the Catholic Church in Rome in that time. The diary was written in 1749. It was hidden and rediscovered in 1985 by an Italian scholar named Giuseppe Sermonetta, who found it in Israel in a library and published it along with his notes. I got that diary because, once again, you can find anything on the internet. And so I found his version of it in a hardback academic book, from, a place where you get discontinued old books. And I read it, and I thought that this would be my next book, that I would write this woman's story, because I thought people had to know. And it was such a dramatic story of a confrontation between a very courageous and very educated 18-year-old young Jewish girl and the most powerful people in the Catholic Church, and how she stood up to them with the conviction of her faith. And also, as I learned this, I learned a lot about what life was like for Jews under the rule of the Pope, because in the Papal States, the Pope was also the secular ruler. So a large swath of Italy was ruled by the Pope. He was the secular ruler as well as the religious ruler. And so in 1555, this man became the Pope. His name was Pope Paul IV. And he was not a well-loved man. He was a very, very strict man in terms of being strict to the scriptures, strict to the tenets of the Catholic Church. And it was at the time when they were having the Council of Trent, which took place in Trentino, and it lasted for several years. And the Council of Trent was called because the Catholic Church was horrified by the Protestants. They were terrified that their one religion would not be the only religion of Europe. And so it became necessary for them to worry about other people under their rule who were not Catholic, specifically the Jews and the Muslims, but most certainly the Jews. So in 1555, no sooner had he ascended the throne of the papacy, but Pope Paul IV wrote a papal bull called Communimus Absurdum. And in that bull, he said, it is utterly absurd and inconvenient that in the shadow of the Vatican, in the very neighborhoods where good Catholics live, Jews live, hire Catholics to be their nannies and maids and to work for them in their businesses without any shame and without any gratitude for the wonderful hospitality that we allow them to live with us. And therefore, he decreed that they would build a wall around several square blocks of Rome in the most undesirable part of the city, because it was the lowest part of the city. And in those days, the Tiber regularly overflowed its banks every few years. So it was a dangerous place. It was a place full of disease and mold. And not only did he decree that these walls be built, but he decided that the Jews should pay for the building of the walls, and that all the Jews throughout Rome should be forced to sell their homes and whatever property they owned. They could not own any property anymore. And they would have to move into whatever accommodations they could find within these few square blocks. And they would have to pay whatever rent the Catholic owners wanted to charge them. And of course, members of the Catholic Church and their families benefited greatly from the sale of these valuable homes throughout Rome, because the Jews were doing really well in Rome. They were fine. And many of them were bankers. So they were doing better than fine. This is the Papal States in yellow. The rest of Italy was not under the Pope's rule. The part you see down here, the green part, was owned by or ruled by the Spanish Bourbons. And you see Sicily is also part of that. And they, of course, expelled all the Jews in 1492. When they expelled them from Spain, they also expelled them from all of this part of Italy and Sicily. They all clambered into Rome, or a lot of them did. Some of them moved to the Levant because they were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire, but many of them moved to Rome. And Venice was its own place, which had its own ghetto, but it was a secular ghetto. It wasn't forced by the Pope, and it didn't last very long. And Tuscany was good for the Jews because the Medici ruled Tuscany, and they were not nearly as frightened of the Jews. So within this walled community, the Pope also, in the same bull, put all kinds of restrictions on the Jews. He thought that within 2 generations, all the Jews would gladly convert to get out of all of this mess that he forced them to do. He was wrong. But they were locked into that ghetto from 1 hour after sunrise to 1 hour after sunset for 300 years. And not one pope who followed him opened those doors. They were allowed out for less than a year during the time when Napoleon briefly conquered Italy. And that was it. And then it got worse because the popes, during the Napoleon period, the popes went off into exile in France, and when they came back, a worse pope came and made things even worse for them. So in addition to being locked in this ghetto, which was not big enough to accommodate all of them, they were heavily taxed. Everything was taxed, and the taxes got worse and worse over the decades, the centuries. They were humiliated. They had to wear yellow hats and veils whenever they left the ghetto, and they were not allowed to leave the ghetto during Holy Week because they didn't want to disturb the Christians. They were, under Gregory the 13th, they were forced to attend conversionary sermons. They would have their regular services in the shul on Saturday morning. And on Saturday afternoon, they would go to a church or be marched to a church. They would take 300 at a time on a revolving basis, so that during the course of a couple of years, everybody had to go at least once. And then they would they would have a preacher who had been a converted Jew, who would then take whatever the Talmud reading was for that morning and somehow find a way to debunk it and turn it into something Catholic. All Jewish literature was censored. There were giant burnings of the Talmud in the Campo Fiore, which is a square not far from the ghetto. And regularly, the Pope's police would come through and try to find any religious books within the homes that they would then confiscate. Of course, they didn't do so well because they didn't read Hebrew, so they'd have to take a rabbi with them, and he would try to convince them that these were all cookbooks or something. They were excluded from the guilds, which meant that they couldn't do any good work. They couldn't make money. The only money they could make was by selling used things, which is how they got into the rag trade, which we still talk about on 7th Avenue. They had to sell used things. Some of them got smart about it. And then when none of that was working, they began the forced baptisms. And that meant that if anybody denounced you, you could be arrested and dragged to this house of catechumeni, where you would be sequestered and forcibly converted. They would have different ways of doing it. And that's what happened to my protagonist. That's what happened to Anna Del Monte. And that's why I wanted to tell her story. That she was dragged off. She was locked in a cell. She was preached to night and day. She was not allowed to get a good night's sleep. They would wake her up in the night, start preaching again. And very few women ever came back. Very few men ever came back from there, almost none. So that was why her diary was so important and so valuable. And that's why they had to hide it. So this is the Rome ghetto as it appeared. As you can see, it was in existence from 1555 to 1870. It's a long time. Here's this is a map you can buy in the ghetto today. The ghetto today is just a tourist destination. You can go on a tour of the ghetto where they'll show you where things used to be, but nothing's really there anymore. It's a place you go to buy stuff. I bought this Morgan David from a jeweler there many, many years ago, and people go there to eat Roman Jewish food, which is nothing like the Ashkenazic food I grew up with, and certainly nothing like the Sephardic food other people grew up with. It's Roman Jewish food. This is the main gate to the ghetto where my arrow is, whoops. And now you can see that the ghetto was right along the Tiber, so that these buildings, which were the lowest part of the ghetto, were regularly flooded. It was a terrible place to live, and the poorest of the poor lived there. The rich of the rich, the richer of the, and their idea of rich was not our idea of rich, would live up here. Here's the gate, and this is called the Via della Rua, and that was this big shopping street. Catholics came there to shop on the weekends because when everything was closed on Sunday, this was open. And this was called the Piazza di Cinque Scuole, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That's where the temple was. But down here, along the river, was where the very poor people lived who couldn't even have enough to eat. And this is the city fish market for the city of Rome. It's not there anymore, but it was for all of the time the ghetto was there. And of course, it was very stinky. So this was not a place anybody wanted to live. So they put the Jews there. This is the main piazza that opens onto the ghetto. It's called the Piazza Judea. And this building was a guardhouse. So this was manned 24 hours a day. Most of the guards belonged to one family, one wealthy family called the Mattei. This is a picture of what the ghetto looked like in the 19th century. No one ever painted the ghetto. No one ever drew the ghetto, because if you were a painter in those days, you made your living by doing very flattering portraits of very rich people, or by painting lovely scenes of gorgeous Rome that the tourists would buy. But one painter named Ettore Franz, who was born in Italy of German parents, did a whole series of paintings that he called Roma Sparito, which was lost Rome, Rome as it was. And he was the only one who painted the ghetto. And this is a picture of the Via della Rua, which, as you can see, is not Madison Avenue. It was very poor and very overcrowded. This is another picture. You can see these women who are sewing, which was, they would go outside because they couldn't afford oil for the lamps or anything. So to see, they would have to sew outside. And this was what many people came to the ghetto for. The Jewish women were known to be fabulous seamstresses and wonderful repairers. They could do what we called, in America, we call French weaving. So if you had a hole in your jacket, they would fix it up and you would never know. And they would, since they had to deal in used clothes, they would buy old clothes and repair them and restore them and fix them up, and people would come to buy those. And here's the Via della Rua again. This is the Tiber Island. So this gives you an idea of how the ghetto came to be and who the Jews really were in Rome. The Jews were the first people to come to Rome. The Jews of Rome were the first Jews on the mainland of Europe. They were the first to come over from what is now Israel and Palestine. This is the Tiber River. So when you came from the other part of the Mediterranean, from the Levant, you were traders. You came to bring bring goods to the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, even. It started before the empire. And down here is Ostia, which is the main port of Rome. You could bring your boat this far up and no further because of this island. This island, the Romans used it as like a quarantine island, like a leper colony, or if any infectious disease, they put them there. And to this day, there's a big hospital there, a big Catholic hospital, but also a small Jewish or Hebraic hospital. The Jews came as traders, and they traded, and they would establish communities here on this part of the river, on this side, the left side, which is called Trastevere, the other side of the Tiber. And the Jews came, and the Syrians came, and all sorts of traders came from North Africa, Muslims and Jews, who lived in beautiful harmony in this neighborhood for a long time. However, in the 5th century, the Emperor Constantine decided he found Jesus, and he converted. And that was the end of our peace and happiness in Italy. Before that, the Jews did very well. They were bankers. Under Julius Caesar, they were senators. But of course, it was illegal to not be Catholic after Constantine. Everybody had to convert or die. And of course, some people died. So that's when our problems began. This is a picture of the sack of Jerusalem that is on the Arch of Titus, which is in the forum. You can see it if you go there as a tourist. And this is celebrating the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70 CE. And you can see them carrying away the menorah and all kinds of artifacts from the temple. And they brought them back to Rome. And they also brought back a whole lot of Jewish slaves. And that was the second wave of Jews to reach Rome. And those slaves built the Colosseum. They built a lot of stuff. Being a slave in Rome wasn't as bad as being a slave in the South of the United States. It was bad enough, but you weren't a slave for life. You could buy your freedom, or your owner could decide to free you, and a lot of them became freed slaves. The ghetto in the 18th century, when my story takes place, was a very crowded place, because although there might have been enough room for all the Jews to move in when they first built it in 1555, more than almost 200 years later, it had grown. The Jews actually had less children than the Catholics. Now, although they didn't practice birth control as far as we know, but they had no room to put them anyway. And because the ghetto was so crowded, if you got married late, because you had to wait to find a room that was available where you could be alone with your wife. You almost had to wait for someone to die or your sister to move out and move in with her in-laws. The population in 1749 was 4,600, and they lived on a space that was less 1/5 the geographic size of any town with a similar population. There were only 100 buildings in the ghetto, and those were not apartment buildings. They weren't big buildings. These were like little 2- or 3-story houses. So over the years, because the ghetto got so crowded, the Jews were forced to build up. And so they would add extra floors to the buildings, some of them very rickety. One of them actually collapsed during a wedding because of too much weight on the floor. And they constructed galleries across the alleyways. And the streets in the ghetto were, if you put your arms out, you could touch either side. They were not meant for carriages. You weren't allowed to have a carriage anyway if you were Jewish. And there certainly weren't any cars. So it was just big enough for 2 people to walk through. And when they started building up, it got very dark in there. The Jews in the Roman ghetto spoke their own dialect. Over the years, they developed a dialect. And although the ghetto was supposed to be a terrible deprivation for them, they came to think of it as their haven. They called it their little haven because they were safe there. The gates were locked at night and until after dawn, and there was nobody there to terrorize them. So they were just among each other, and they were very safe. So they developed their own dialect, which is called Romanesco Hebraico. And a lot of Roman slang to this day comes from the ghetto dialect, which was a combination of Italian with some Hebrew thrown in. They used words I recognize from my Ashkenazic background, like goyim is goyim, a goy is a goy, and things like that. And then they had their own culture and their own music. The Roman rites were not Sephardic or Ashkenazic, they were Roman. They had their own thing. Then there were social classes within the ghetto. So in the beginning, the bankers were at the top of the line, and they could afford to rent the most lavish places. However, in 1668, the Catholic Church decided to make its own banks. So they rescinded the banking licenses, which was a disaster in many ways. It was a disaster for the Jews because until then, the bankers had been feeding the very poorest of the poor. And it was a disaster for the entire Roman economy because that was being held up by Jewish banking, and all the aristocrats were in debt to the Jews. The church was in debt to the Jews. So the whole system almost collapsed. The second level were the riki, and they were richer than the average person, not rich by our standards, but they weren't bankers. My protagonist, Anna Del Monte, came from that class because her father's family had been bankers. And they figured out that, well, if we can only sell used things, that includes antiques. And at that time, the Catholic Church had created a new group of nobles. They had elevated and given titles to people, and there were many empty palaces in the streets of Rome. So they would take over these palaces, and then they had to furnish them. And he did that. And he would give them everything, including portraits that they would say were family portraits, or valuable things that they would say were family heirlooms. Then there were the mediocri, which were people of modest means, which basically meant they had enough to eat. And then there were the poveri, which was really about a third of the population. And those were the people who lived in the most dire circumstances. Unlike other Romans, the Jews could read and write. All the Jews could read and write. And even the women could read and write, which was very unusual and made the Catholics very nervous around the women and very suspicious. They had all kinds of powers that the Catholic women didn't have. They could sign contracts, they could run businesses. They had their own teachers, and of course they had their own yeshivas. But there was a wonderful rabbi named Luria who decided that it was a bad idea that the Jews only learned the Torah, and that they should learn other things. And they should learn the Greeks and the Romans, and they should learn arithmetic and other things. So there was another kind of culture in the ghetto that didn't exist among people of their means in the Catholic world. This is the Cinque Scole, they call it that, which means the 5 temples, or the five shuls. Scola is an Italian word that means like our Yiddish word shul. So in that first papal bull, the Pope decreed that there could only be one building, one synagogue for all the Jews, which was a problem because there were the Roman Jews who had their rights. There were all those Jews who got expelled by the Spanish and Portuguese, including the ones who came from Sicily and the southern part of Italy, Naples. They had their rights. And then there were some few French Jews. There were very few Ashkenazic Jews. Those were up north in northern Italy. So they took this building and they divided it into 5 small shuls. And there was a Scola Tempio, which was attended by the oldest Roman families. That was the Roman rites. And then there was a Scala Nova, they called it the new shul, which was people who were practicing the Roman rites, but they were not from Rome itself, they were from outskirts. And they had a Castilian Spanish shul, a Catalan school, and a Sicilian shul for the different ones. And it was tight. In the beginning, these shuls were very simple. They were just empty rooms. They did have women's balconies, which were just a little bit above because they didn't have a lot of room, but they had screens. The same families would belong to each temple for 3 centuries. This is a painting that I found in the Jewish Museum in Rome. It was done around the same period as my book, and it's taken inside a shul. It was painted inside a shul. It's almost a satirical painting, and it shows you that in a place that crowded, there was no place for people to get together. So they would get together in the shul when it wasn't being used for services. And you see it's all men. And there's a couple of religious people actually trying to study the Torah, but everybody else is just kibitzing, and the little boys are playing, no women. Over the years, then the shuls became much more lavish because the richer people made donations to the shuls, and they would put their family crest on everything. So you could see that this came from their family. And this is from my Anna Del Monte's family, which were the Del Montes. This is every family in Rome at that time had a family stemma, even if they weren't rich, a family coat of arms, I guess you call it, it's a stemma in Italian. So this is theirs. These are the mountains, the Lion of Judah and the crescent moon. This is one of the most valuable things. It was given by Anna's ancestor 100 years before she was born. It's a Torah crown with precious stones. And this beautiful thing was donated by Anna Del Monte's father in her honor when she was taken from him. She was cleaning up with her sister and her grandmother after dinner on a Sunday night, and they came and banged on her door and took her away at gunpoint. They put a gun on her father's chest if he tried to speak to her. They dragged her out, threw her into a carriage, and galloped her to the house of catechumeni and threw her into a cell. And she could not, in those days, a Jewish person could not get within 100 rods of the casa de catechumeni, so they couldn't even see her from looking up at a window. She had no communication with the outside world whatsoever. The Jews realized early on that they would need to have their own self-government to prevent chaos. They were governed by the church within the ghetto, and there was an archbishop who was named the prelate vicegerent, who represented the Pope to the Jews in the ghetto, and he answered to a cardinal. But the dirty work, the day-to-day work was his. But below him, they developed a Capitoli, which was like a constitution, and they had 3 governors who ruled or who managed the ghetto. Rule is the wrong word. And everything in their constitution was designed to prevent any kind of misuse of power. So there were 3 guys, not 1 guy, and each guy, they were called mamunim in Hebrew and fattori in Italian. They each had a term of only 1 year, and there were 3 of them who did it jointly. One of them, for a while, was Anna Del Monte's older brother, Tranquillo. And Tranquillo, at one point, wrote to the Jews of England, and he said, we would like to emigrate en masse, all the Jews of Rome, because it's impossible for us to live here anymore. They're taxing us so much we can't eat or survive. And the Jews of England wrote back, and they said, we'd love to invite you, but we have just gotten a huge number of immigrants from Holland, and we can't possibly accommodate anybody else. And this week and last week, with what was going on in the Middle East, I kept thinking, what if there had been an Israel? What if there had been an Israel then? Anyway, below the 3 governors, there was a 10-member board. And then there were the Council of 60, which came from the upper classes, the 20 bankers, 20 came from the banking class, 20 came from the rich class, 20 came from the middle class. And of those 20, 10 were always Italian, and 10 were what they called ultramontani, which meant that they came from outside of Italy. And Italy is, as you know, a peninsula. The border that they have is the Alps. So they came from the other side of the mountains, the ultramontani. And within the government, they would have people who were appointed to do jobs. They rotated every 3 months because these weren't good jobs. They would be like collecting alms for the poor, distributing bread. And there was a controller who kept the books, but he only had a 1-year non-renewable term. This is the vicegerent Ferdinando Maria di Rossi, who figures very strongly in my story because he was the guy who was in charge of the ghetto for the Pope, on behalf of the Pope, during the period of Anna Del Monte's incarceration. And he was not a bad guy. I don't think any of them were bad guys. He did not believe in forced baptism. He thought, why should anybody have to be forced to love Jesus? Because he, of course, was brought up to love Jesus. He thought it should be natural. So he was against it, but he had to follow what the Pope wanted. And the Pope at the time of Anna Del Monte was a very enlightened man in many ways. He was a correspondent of Voltaire, who was a famous heretic. But he really believed that all the Jews were going to go to hell for eternity if he didn't convert them. And he was very, very excited about converting them. He would make a huge party, great parades every time one was converted. So Ferdinando di Rossi, really her life, Anna Del Monte's life was in his hands, and he had to deal with it. This is the building which still stands, which was the Casa dei Catecumeni, known for its frieze on the outside of the building, which is the Mary and Jesus baby. Forced baptisms were extremely popular with the church during Anna's period, during the 18th century. As you can see, that was the height of it. You can see that it drops down here. One of the reasons was that during this period, Napoleon opened the gates. And the other reason is that in 1870, the unification of Italy took place and the ghetto gates were opened permanently. This is Honest Pope. This is Benedict the 14th. And he has a very sweet face, really. But he really wanted to convert all the Jews. That was his thought. That was his job on earth. And so if one was converted, he would be so happy. He would dress them in white silks. I mean, maybe this was a person who never worn a new garment in their life. And now they're in white silks head to toe, riding in a carriage, which Jews were forbidden from riding in carriages. And he would make a parade through the streets of the ghetto to show all the Jewish people what happened. Most of the time, if one of your loved ones was taken by the Spieri, which is what they call the Pope's police, it means cops, to the Casa dei Catecumeni, you never saw them again. You never knew what happened to them. You never heard from them, because once they were taken, if they were forcibly converted, then they were forbidden from ever seeing any Jew again. That meant everybody in their family, no matter how close. You couldn't see your husband, you couldn't see your mother. If they took away a pregnant woman, they would keep her in the house of Catecumeni until she gave birth, and then immediately take the child away from her and convert it, so that the only way she could ever see her child again was to convert herself. So they were especially happy to have women. They were especially happy to have young women who they thought would be more impressionable and easier to convert, and also that those young women could then birth many good Catholics. This is the actual diary. This is the actual front page of the diary of Anna del Monte. It says in Italian, abduction of Signora Anna del Monte, my sister, who was taken to the house of Catecumeni, and it has, or the house of converts, and there you see the date, 1749. Her brother, we think, drew this, and the book is written in his handwriting, and we know that because he then became one of the menumim, one of the governors of the ghetto. So his signature was around, and his notes at meetings. And also he wrote a play that was performed at Purim or something. And so we have his handwriting, and his handwriting is in this. So scholars have different theories. Some scholars think that she dictated it to him. He says in the preface that he wrote to the diary that he made 7 copies. So it could be that she wrote it and then he copied it. It could be that she dictated it to him, and it could also be that he just wrote it, that he just made it up, depending what you want to believe. But he made this very elaborate frontispiece, and of course he has the family crest on there. In 1870, the last battle was fought in the gates of Rome at the Porta Pia in September of 1870 to break through the walls of Rome. And that was when Italy finally became united as one peninsula, one country. And the Pope's army by that time put up very small resistance. It was no big deal. But when they got to the gates, and the colonel had to say, shoot, sparate. None of them would shoot, because the Pope said anybody who shoots and breaks through the walls of the papal states of Rome will be excommunicated. So a Jewish guy actually fired the first shot, and he said, "I'll shoot." And the Pope it was Leo, and he was so horrified. And I love this because it's so ironic. He was so horrified that he refused to come out of the Vatican from then on. And here's this person who has imprisoned all the Jews in this ghetto for 300 years, and he's imprisoned by his own self. After the ghetto was liberated, it was actually torn down for the most part. It was so crowded and filthy, and I think the Romans were ashamed of it. So it was mostly torn down. They tried to keep the shul, the Tempio Cinque Scola, but there was a fire, who knows how it started, and they were able to pull some of the artifacts out, but that's it. And in 1903, this building opened. This is the Tempio Maggiore. It's still there. You can get a tour of it if you go to Rome, and the tour guide will tell you about the ghettos, because you won't be able to see much there since it was torn down. But all the big churches in Rome are open to the public for most of the day. You can just walk in. You cannot just walk into the Tempio Maggiore because of the 1960s. Somebody decided to open fire on the Jews as they were coming out of the temple. So now there's a guard there with a machine gun all the time. And if you want to go inside, you have to get a tour or you go to services, and it's very well guarded. But it's a very beautiful place. It's very elaborate. As you can see, they had a contest to see who would win and who would come up with the design. It's a beautiful building. You can see the dome from all over Rome. October 16th, 1943 was the day that the Jews of Rome were told to appear with one suitcase. I think you know the rest of the story. At the square in front of the Tempio Maggiore. And they were loaded onto these trucks and taken to the train station bound for the east. They were told that there were no Jews who would be taken out of Italy. They would only be taken to concentration camps in Italy, but that was a lie. Before that, the Jews were, of course, persecuted once the Nazis came in. They were told they had to give all their valuables to the Nazis for the war effort. Even the women had to give their gold wedding rings. And Jews told on each other. It was a very ugly time. And very few, of course, who left ever came back. But today in the ghetto, these cobblestones that you see down here, many of them have brass plates with the names of those who were taken away. In 1904, when the temple opened, the Tempio Maggiore, the main temple of Rome, the king of Italy, because we started with the king before the war, Vittorio Emanuele, came and shook hands with the head rabbi, who was Vittorio Castellori, as you can see in this picture to the left. To the right, we have 1986, when for the first time, and when you think about where this started, it's just amazing. For the first time, the Pope, John Paul II, came and shook hands with Elliot Toath, who was the head rabbi of Rome in 1986. And since then, all of the popes have come to the ghetto. Benedict came after John Paul, and of course, Francis came. And that is the end of my presentation. If you would like to ask questions, I'm available. If you want to find out more, you can go to my website. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Joey, for sharing the background story of your book. And I'm going to now close your screen. We will, of course, share your website and also this presentation, and also where you can read more or buy the book. So we will send all this out tomorrow, and I will try to read some questions that come in. And I also want to let you know that next week we will have actually one of our regular talks on the 26th about the Jews of Italy. So if you want to learn a bit more in detail, also from the beginning until today, we will have Miriam Camerini, who is from Italy, and she's a theater director and also author, and also very active member of the Milan community. So you can join us then. I will put the link here, but we will share it with you also tomorrow. And now I will read some questions. Some you answered during the talk, so I won't read those. There was a question about, sorry, I need to find it. Is it true that Jews were restricted in the kinds of fish they could get out of the Tiber? I heard that they could only fish small fish like sardines and anchovies and could not catch any larger fish.
I have not read that anywhere.
Okay.
So, I mean, people who fished in the Tiber were really taking chances because people also defecated in the Tiber. Yeah, so And people took their water from the Tiber. One pope finally decided that in his goodness, he was going to place a fountain in the ghetto so that the Jews could get water from the fountain, because otherwise they would have to carry it from outside the ghetto, which is kind of far. But I'd never heard that about fish.
Thank you. Were there other non-Catholic people in the area besides Jews?
Yeah,
And
there
if
were
they-
there were Muslims, but there were
And-
very, very few compared to the Jews, and they were not ghettoized.
Mhm. Okay. The question was if they were subject to the same sorts of restrictions as the Jews. So other than the ghetto, did they also have restrictions or?
I'm sure there were restrictions, but they were not put in the ghetto. That was just Jews.
Okay. There was a comment here that the Great Synagogue of Rome, there was an attack exactly on October 9 in 1982 by Palestinian terrorists.
Right.
And a two-year-old toddler was killed.
Yes, that's right. And that's why you can't get in there now. And that's why they have a guard with machine guns, and they have a guard house right at the corner there where the ghetto, where the temple is.
Yes. There was someone asking if you could read a page from the book.
Do we have time?
Yeah, I think we do.
Okay. This is from the beginning of the book. It's just right after the introduction. Rome, 21st of April, 1749. Third year of Iyar, 5509, Monday, Yom Shani. One bell, 1 hour after dawn. The light of a Roman April rouses the narrow ghetto streets. From balcony railings, worn garments and harlequin shades of red, violet, blue, and green wave like flags in the warm morning breeze. On the Strada della Rua, a merchant arranges baskets overflowing with used bits and pieces, tableware, kitchen utensils, doorknobs, drawer pulls, hinges half hidden in his doorway. A jeweler sits at a table covered in warm black velvet, arranging and rearranging his display of coral and silver. Stray cats chase each other through the rubbish and shadows of the alleys, down to the Strada della Fiumara on the banks of the Tiber, where the air reeks of fish and feces. Ancient stone houses slump, shoulder to shoulder, like drunken old men. Every decrepit room, every stifling attic, every dank cellar home to 5 or 6 people. Women carry chairs out onto the street, maneuvering to find a shard of sunlight. Graying heads bend down, nose to fabric, so that ruined eyes can see tiny stitches. Calloused hands mend a linen tablecloth, reline a jacket, add fresh lace to the ragged hem of a skirt. One of the women is nearly bald. Another's neck is gnarled by a goiter. Most of them are missing teeth. A woman wheezes, shoulders rising with the effort of each breath, then coughs violently, lungs clogged with lint and dirt. Even the youngest of the women looks old. They are the daughters of Zion, descendants of Rachel, Esther, and Mirame. On a rotten wooden landing near the Arco di Azimele, a woman stops beating dust from a rug and leans over the railing to berate the ducks, goats, stray dogs, and naughty boys who are causing a commotion in the alley below. At the Piazza delle Tre Cannelle, a plump grandmother staggers from the fountain, a full bucket balanced on her head. And in the tiny Piazzetta del Pancotto, the aroma of freshly baked bread breezes about, momentarily cloaking the stench of the public toilets. Near the Piazza delle Cinque Scole, elegant English gentlemen in search of souvenirs use silver-tipped walking sticks to poke through crates of cheap treasures. A mosaic rendering of the Colosseum, a fragment of marble statuary scraped and pounded to appear ancient, Ladies examine etchings of squalid streets made quaint, holding the cards away from their faces with gloved fingers. Just outside the gate of Severus, 4 guards, young and muscular, joke and laugh, kick the cobblestones with the tips of their boots, adjust the pistols lodged in their belts. While on the other side of the gates, street peddlers, wearing the yellow caps that mark them as Jews, throng the Piazza Judea, their wares tied up in bundles or piled onto pushcarts. They wait impatiently, indignantly, not daring to raise their voices. This is an old game the guards are playing, dawdling past the hour when the heavy iron bars should be lifted, the gates opened. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you for also reading it. That really adds a lot. Someone asked why you decided to make your book a novel rather than a nonfiction book.
You know, somebody famously said, historians write what happened. Historical novelists write how it felt. Knowing what happened is one thing, but being able to experience it through the eyes of an 18-year-old girl is something else. And although I read many, many academic books about the Rome ghetto, I never felt what I felt about what it was like to live there, except what I read Anna's diary. That's why I made it a novel. And I also thought this was a story that should be told, because even in Italy, Roman Jews don't know what it was like in the ghetto. It's not something people talk about or want to remember. And I knew that more people would read about it. All those academic books have been there for decades. More people would read about it if I made it a novel and told somebody's real story. Not just Anna's story, but her parents' story, her sister's story, her brother's story, and so on.
Thank you. Many people wrote already in the chat that they really look forward to reading your book. So the next question is would be a bit of a spoiler, but I don't know if you want to answer in some non-spoiling way. Someone asked what happened to the imprisoned girl and whether she survived.
Not telling.
Yes, so everyone needs to get the book and read it. Yeah, we don't wanna spoil it, that's for sure. So let me see if there are more questions. Are you familiar with the Pope's Jews who lived in the shadow of the Vatican by invitation of the Pope, who protected them from harm so that they would be alive to see the Messiah return and they could be proven wrong for all eternity?
I have never heard that story, but I would love to know about it. I never came across it in any of my research.
Okay. Yes. Is there a way to acquire a signed copy of the book? That was a question.
Well, I'm in Westchester right now. I'm going to be at the Chappaqua Library tomorrow night. I'll be in Katona at the reading room on Thursday. If you want to come, I'll sign your book. Otherwise, write to me and I will send you a signed bookplate.
Okay, thank you. I think this refers to the part that you read, if this is from the novel or is it Anna's words, but maybe you can answer in general, like how much did you use Anna's words from the diary and how much did you write?
I wrote most of it, but the first thing I did when I started to work on the book was I translated the diary. And some of it was in Hebrew. But most of it was either in Italian or the Italian dialect, the Italian Hebrew dialect. And luckily, I was able to find a glossary of the dialect because there was a poet who wrote in the dialect, and I was able to get a copy of his book, and it had a glossary in the back from the dialect into Italian, and so I could write that. And when I first started writing the book, I tried to really just write her diary as a fiction. But the agent I showed it to who was a close friend for a long time, read all my stuff, said, I'm getting claustrophobic. And I began to realize that I had to say what was going on, meanwhile, back in the ghetto, and expand the story into what was going on in the ghetto. So all that is my words. And I also wrote the diary. I wrote the book first person, like the diary. And then I realized that didn't work. So then I wrote it in third person. So as I continued to work on the book, it became less and less the diary and more my words, but her words are in it. There's plenty of her words in it because I didn't make up what happened to her in that place or who the people were, how she felt about it. It's all in the diary. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. And has the diary been translated to English?
Very recently, after I finished my book, a scholar from, I think he's from New Zealand, named Kenneth Stowe, Stowe, published a book called Tranquillo and Anna. Tranquillo was her brother's name. And he has his version of a translation. It's not a translation that I like. I mean, I like my translation better. Translating is so, it's so subjective because there's no such thing as a literal translation. So you can read it in English if you get that book.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked about the talk we'll have next week. So it won't be about Milan, it will be about all of Italy, so south and north included, and also a bit more about Rome as well. But our speaker is from Milan, so that's why I mentioned Milan in particular. There was a question if there are plans for an audiobook.
Yes, there is an audiobook coming out. It's in production right now. I hope it will be out next month.
Thank you. And there was a question about the yellow caps that they had to wear. What were the shapes of them?
Well, at the time of my book, the shape was the shape that other hats were, which were the four-cornered hats, like you see when you see pictures of the American Revolution. They wore the same hats that everybody else wore, but they wore them in yellow. They had to be yellow, and they had to wear Jewish stars on their clothing and on their hats, which is exactly where the Nazis got that good idea. The women had to wear yellow veils, which was a particularly horrible thing because the prostitutes also had to wear yellow veils. So you can imagine what it was like for a Jewish woman to walk down the streets of Rome.
Thank you. Will the audiobook be with your voice?
No, it will be with an actor.
But I assume that someone enjoyed listening to you reading it, so
that makes me happy.
Sorry, I'm just trying to see. There was a question, how did you become interested in this subject? You already spoke about it a little bit in the beginning, but if you want to add anything to what you already said.
Well, I moved to Rome full-time 20-something years ago. And before that, I came a lot to Rome because I used to be an opera singer. I studied to be an opera singer, so I went there to study when I was quite young, and I fell in love with Rome, and I kept going back. So because I'm Jewish, you hardly ever meet any Italian Jews, but there aren't that many, I guess, compared to if you're from New York, you're used to seeing a lot or LA, where I was, used to seeing lots more Jewish people. But anyway, I know some. But I didn't know anything about what happened to the Jews of Rome. And because I didn't experience any kind of anti-Semitism, I didn't think there would be, or there have ever been. I didn't know. I mean, there was a ghetto there, but it was a place where you went to get fried artichokes, or to buy, Jewish jewelry or mezuzahs or menorahs. And then I found out there was a ghetto because I went on a tour of the Temple Maggiore with actually a friend who I think is here, their son, who was spending his junior year in Florence. And he came down to visit me, and I took him to the temple, and we got the lecture, and she talked about the ghetto. So I thought, why didn't they convert? They had 300 years of being locked up under this terrible situation, and nobody converted, or it's just a very, very small percentage. I wonder why not. And I always kind of wondered that, but I didn't know anything until I found her diary. And I guess if I wasn't Jewish, I wouldn't have written this book. I wouldn't have been as interested in it. But obviously, I got emotional about it when I read it. So, because you always thought, oh, it was horrible where my grandparents came and they had the pogroms and blah, 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 but not in Italy. Wrong. So.
Thank you. And the last question I will read, if you live in Rome now.
I don't live in Rome anymore. I lived there for about 15 years, but for the last 7 years, I've been living outside of Rome in the countryside of Umbria, in southern Umbria.
Thank you. So now we are at the end of our time. So I would like to thank you, Joey, again for sharing with us this history and your work. And we got a lot of comments from people saying that they're eager to buy and read your book. So hopefully many people will have the pleasure to read it. And thank you everyone for joining us today. As we mentioned earlier, tomorrow we will send out a follow-up email which will include this recording and also all the links where to get Joey's book and a few more that are related and might be interesting to you. So thank you very much for joining us today. And those of you who are in Israel right now, we wish you safety and we wish you well, and our thoughts are with you. And I just wanted to say that again as well. So thank you, everyone, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. It's great.
Thank you so much, Dora.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.